Hey guys, Mark here. Welcome back to the channel. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning because I don't sleep very good and I work a lot, and this seems to be the only time that I find to work on these YouTube videos these days. So anyways, out in the shop, and in preparation for the Qs1 to come, we spoke in the last video about how we're just trying to be a little bit proactive and have things ready. I thought I'd sit down and kind of show you guys how I pre-plan wiring of a boat. There's nothing real trick or special to it. There's no fancy AutoCAD or anything. It's just basically I sit down with a notepad, start scratching down notes and coming up with a plan, figuring out where I'm running wires and what gauge of wire I'm running and that sort of stuff. So anyways, I'll just kind of blow through that stuff, show you how I do it, and hopefully it's helpful for you. Enjoy. The first thing that I do is I just get a pad and pen, and I just sit down and start citing off the components, the electrical components that are involved in the boat. You know, obviously you're gonna have some sort of a switch panel. You're gonna, you know, you've got a trim pump, you've got a trim computer, you've got, you know, your data, fuel pump, that sort of thing. So again, just sit down with a pen and paper, start writing those things down and making a list of what we're working with here. So here we go. Trim solenoids, ECU. So now that I've established the basic list of components that we're going to use, got them laid out, the next step is to create a list of inputs and outputs, and from there I can figure out load, wire gauge, and that sort of thing. So I'll go over the components. I kind of lay them out in front of me, and then they're there. I got the instruction sheets available for them, and then that way it's, you know, I can refer to the sheets and it'll tell me load, amperage, and that sort of stuff. Okay guys, so I got my basic components all laid out here. I've got my relay panel assembly, I've got my switch panel, I've got my data logger, trim computer instructions, fuses, that sort of stuff. I just put that stuff there for a visual. It sort of helps me, I don't know, it comes to mind as I'm working on it. I try not to forget that kind of thing. But anyways, I think the first thing we do is we're going to plot out the switch panel. We'll put it over on the sheet here and we'll show basically there's some inputs to this, the way that we're running it, and then there's going to be some outputs. So we'll sort of put the outputs, which would be output of the switch panel to input of relays. And I'll break that down right here now. Okay guys, so switch panel, here's what we've got. You've got your switch panel in, obviously your red, your 12 volts, and your black for your ground. It's pretty straightforward. And then your output of your switch panel, but remember, I'm sending these all to relay. So this is low current switches. There's not a lot of power going through here. So we'll go through these items here. Obviously you got your start with your yellow and red. I try and sort of keep with them or colors. ECU is purple, fuel pump I use white, trim blue, that's trim timer, not trim itself. Bilge pumps gray, and then a primer. I ordered or incorporated a primer in the switch box for Brendan's ECU, yellow and black. So maintaining that. So the next step is knowing that these are just going to a relay. I have no concern over load. So I'm literally going to send the output from the switch panel to the input of the relay in probably a 20 or 22 gauge. So I just got to look at what we've got here. It's going to be again 20 gauge, purple 20 gauge, fuel again 20 gauge, trim 20 gauge, bilge 20. They're all 20. We're just turning on relays. There's no load. That's what I love about relays. There's no load. So the switch panel does very, very little work other than turn on relays. And always remember that. So. Okay, next step, we're talking relay board out. So we've brought our power from our switch panel to the relay. Actually, that's a lie. We've supplied power to the switch panel, power at 12 volt in the ground. From there, you know, switched on power, our outputs at the switch panel, inputs at the relay board. So from the relay board out, we're going to copy this in colors. We're going to go, bilge is going to be gray. Start is, yellow and red. ECM is purple. Fuel is white. I can't even spell. And then trim computer is, what do we say for trim computer? Blue. And then I'm gonna break down the trim computer here in a few minutes. But these are your outputs. So again, because our outputs are carrying a little bit more load, so we need to know what we're working with. Bilge pump. I figure I took a look at I can't remember what the current rating was on the pumps that I have, but it's very, very small. So I feel pretty comfortable with 16 gauge here. Start 16 gauge. Again, we're only turning on a solenoid. ECM purple 16 gauge. Fuel pump though. So I run a Bosch 044 pump. I've heard guys claim they pull all kinds of current. I've actually put an amp clamp on it and it doesn't pull that much. I have no problem with going with a 14 gauge. And then the trim computer. This is where the trim computer gets a little bit interesting. If you read the instructions, it tells you when connect to a 12 volt or 60 volt source capable of driving 40 amps. I don't know what they think is 40 amps. I don't know. That one stumped me. And I've tried to dig into that a little bit, but anyways, still though, just because of that, I think that I would supply, I wouldn't want to put 40 amps through 14 gauge, but I don't see any reason why you can't. So in this case, because nothing's going to draw, it's only going to draw 40 amps if it has a short. So I always run 14 gauge to the trim timer. Okay guys, so if you're sticking with me here, we've basically sort of laid out the switch panel, the wires out of the switch panel, power and ground into the switch panel out to relay board, and then from the relay board out to the component. I'm going to show you on the piece of paper here, and I just sort of failed to mention here that this is where your fuses come into play. So I like to put the fuses on the load side. Some people put them on the input side, but I'd rather put them on the load side. I think that's where the most damage is done. It's the most current. So leaving the relay and heading out to each component, i.e. the fuel pump, i.e. the ECU is where I'd like to fuse it. So I'm going to draw the fuses in here, and then basically carried by the load, you can kind of figure out what fuses you're going to need, you know. Fuel pump can draw fairly heavy. I'd probably put a 30 amp fuse in the fuel pump. It can draw, shouldn't, but it can. And then again, out to the trim timer and a data logger is milliamps. I'm not too awful worried about that. I mean, it's going to be fused, of course, don't get me wrong, but probably 5 amp fuses, lots. So anyways, yeah, next step is fuses, and then we're going to go over data. We're going to go over the trim timer and how it's wired, and we could go from there. Okay guys, so again, on the output, fuse. Again, this is just sort of a brief list of kind of what we're doing first. This isn't the schematic or the layout. This is just kind of us kind of making a mental note of what needs to be there, what we need to put in place, and that sort of stuff. I might scratch when I do one of these. I might scratch this out 5 times until and change things and move stuff around. Again, it's just rough notes, and then they get neater as they go. So. Yes, I gotta apologize again. I'm not very good at this one-handed stuff, holding the camera in one hand and writing with the other and whatnot. I can't write at the best of times, but anyways, I apologize this. So next is data, and that's super simple because there's literally 12 volts in and a ground. So simple, and there's not much current there. It's going to be fused, and so I'm gonna just use like a 20 gauge. I like small wire, and if you use good quality wire like we like to use, we keep all this Tefsel and stuff in stock. Man, you can get away with a lot smaller. You can put loads through 22 gauge Tefsel that you can't put through, you know, some 16 gauge cheaper stuff. So anyways, I like to keep it small, keeps it tight. Okay, so from here we just move on to the trim timer, trim computer. I don't feel the need to draw it out onto the paper because, again, those are just rough notes that we're making, and the schematic's right here. I'm going to draw it out nicer in a few minutes and go over that with you guys. But here, very, very, very standard, straightforward. You know, you got your 12 volts supplied here. It talks about your timer output wire. So basically to your trim solenoid for your 24 volt trim, 36 volt trim. You know, your black for your ground, and then your trigger wire, which is basically on your full throttle switch on your throttle pedal. So very, very straightforward. As far as wire gauges go, again, this one here, again, we spoke about this briefly, but, you know, calling for upwards, you know, capable of driving 40 amps. I don't believe that it'll ever drive 40 amps unless there's a short. And then if, in such case, the fuse is going to take over anyways. But anyways, I usually say with 14 gauge at this point, 14 gauge to the trim pump solenoid. Again, we're only energizing a solenoid, not a lot of current going through it, but it does travel a little bit of a distance. Ground, you're basically just grounding the trim timer. 16 gauge would be more than enough, sufficient. And then your 12 volt trigger wire. Again, I have 14 gauge here only because I take it off a positive stud up near the front that's on a circuit breaker that also supplies the power delivery side to the 12 volt up and down switch, and we're going to go over that in a few minutes here too. So 14 gauge over, but again, it's just a trigger, it's just an energizer, so it's not awful much, but very, very simple. So we'll move this over to the newer schematic with the other stuff, and I'll show you guys that here in a few minutes. Okay guys, so if you're still with me, a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo there that I kind of threw out at you, but we're getting over to the next step. I'm going to kind of show you what happens from here. We just kind of made some rough notes of what the components were and what they needed to have to them and from them. You know, we're going to touch on the fuse side here now. The outputs, I like to fuse the output side of things. Some people put them on the input side. I like the output side because that's where the heavier load is, and I feel that's where the most damage could be done. So every item there that leaves will be fused before it makes its way to that component. So I'm going to show you how I transfer that over into a notepad. I used to drop a little bit of a schematic, actually. I found it was, I don't know, I liked laying out the components and drawing all the wires to them in color and just kind of making my own schematic, but I don't really do that anymore. I just write it in a book, and then I could pass the book to the customer, and you know, it's got all the info they'd ever need to go chasing a problem or whatnot. So again, if I haven't bored you to death and you haven't switched off yet, now I'm going to switch this stuff over to the book and just show you how I write it out, and that's about it. So please follow along. Okay guys, I didn't want to bore you with a time-lapse video I was going to, but what's the sense just in watching me try and color and draw. So anyways, like I said, we've got rough notes here, and remember I said a minute back, man, sometimes I'll go over these 5, 6, 7 times, 4 times, throw them out, redo them, that sort of thing. So these are rough notes. Nothing has to be carved in stone. Even this one here, this is a pretty good outline of what we're going to do or what we're going to use, but I probably just make it neater now at this point. You know, I changed a couple things as I was doing it and whatnot, but as opposed to starting all over fresh, the purpose of this video, I think this works fine. So basically what I did is I basically drew this back out again, and I used a little color code and wire gauge beside it, you know, so our switch panel inputs, outputs, with colors, and the wire gauge that the appropriate wire gauge that I'm going to use. And then, you know, I go down through, you know, your switch panel, inputs and outputs, your trim timer, your 12 volt trim switch, as well as your data logger. That's essentially it. Then I went to relay board outputs to show you, you know, like I say, 16 gauge, 14 gauge on some of these, 22 on some, depending on what they're doing. And then I just kind of make a reference to where they're going. So 16, you know, crank, for example, 16 gauge to starter. We're not going to fuse that because it's momentary. And then, you know, of course, your bilge, 16 gauge, fuse to the bilge. Data, fuel. I mean, same fuel. I use white, so I just standard is, you know, for diagram sake, is 2 black lines indicate a white. ECU and trim timer, they're all broken down. And then I made a list of the fuses: ECU, fuel, data, trim timer. Now, again, these are just reference points. And when I complete this, I put an AM clamp on every item and then choose the fuse accordingly. So please, this is for educational purposes only. This doesn't mean that this is what we need to do. These are just sort of the numbers out of my head that I think is where they sort of need to be. But by all means, I would AM clamp them to make a decision on what the fuse output would be. So, okay guys, so there you have it. I hope I didn't bore you to death with that. That was just sort of a breakdown. That was the start of how I start any wiring project with that. I just try and make notes. I feel that if we make notes like that, we're more prepared. When the boat shows up here and we get going, it goes quicker. We got a better handle on what we need to get for material, and lay it out. And then that you just set that in the boat, and it's a reference point as you're going along. It just makes things go along faster. It does. And then you could always keep this with the boat or pass it on to the customer or whatever. And then they've got reference. So if there's ever a problem, they can go to their wiring schematic and say, okay, this is what needs to be here. This is what this wire should be. So anyways, just a little something that I do. Again, not saying it's right or wrong, because heaven forbid, it seems when you say something on YouTube, it's gospel. I'm just sort of saying what I do and what's worked for me. So I hope you could take a tidbit of information from this, use it in your own project. And as always, I appreciate you. Thank you for chiming in. I'm going to head out. I'm super tired. It's late, and I got to get to work in the morning. So I appreciate you all. Thank you very much. Please share, like, subscribe. As always, we're getting so close to 1,000 viewers, and it's really important that we get there for the algorithm. So again, appreciate you. Thank you all. Good night.